Hi, great facilitators. Lisa Marie back and looking at the high performance strategy. One of the ways in which we're going to be positioning the high performance strategy on day 2 is through something called the performance spectrum. So would like to share with you some key points about the performance spectrum. The performance spectrum is happening when the time of day when we would select 3 tools. We would select some tools to give to teams, and they have to identify 3 ways in which these tools that we already have in our toolbox up levels performance. So that's where we are. And key point to the participants is that we're going to highlight that a promise that we make to our participants is they're going to walk away with the ability to improve results by accelerating their performance. And we're going to do that by exploring the performance spectrum as a means to define high performance, but also position the how, and we know the how is through our high performance strategy, formerly known as the communication spiral. So I will now demonstrate what's in the leader guide, the facilitator leader guide, on facilitating a portion of the high performance strategy. So it seems everyone wants to have high performing individuals and teams. Typically, how effective are managers at up-leveling performance in the employees that they're responsible for? Wow. We hear those comments quite a lot wherever we go around the world from leaders like yourselves. Yeah. So, where does the human experience fit into one's ability to do this successfully? In other words, how much value do you as a leader place on ensuring that in every process of delivering better and more effective results, the people delivering those results are fulfilled because of that experience? Of course, what we're talking about is performance. The better we perform, the more likely we are to succeed and feel fulfilled. So, briefly, Joe, how would you define performance? What does performance mean? Oh, yeah. So, very much correlated to the behaviors that we've been talking about in the Moving It Forward formula. Thanks for that. So, whose performance is most important to up-level? Your own? Other individuals? Or the teams that you work on? Right? How could we separate the 3? They're all really important. So, throughout the time that we've been together, you've provided many example situations where leaders are actually sabotaging their own best efforts, where they're hurting people, and thus the results. The funny thing is that they're typically doing this with good intentions, the intentions of actually improving performance and accelerating their results. Yet they're not getting the results that they anticipated. You know, it's as if there's a spectrum or performance spectrum. Let's look at that. A performance spectrum. There are 3 phases or categories of the performance spectrum. Let's look at those. One would be the disengaged. The second would be engaged. And third would be ownership. So according to Gallup, which we explored yesterday, there are 2 levels of disengagement. Joe, would you read those off the flip chart over there? Right. 17% are what's considered actively disengaged. What's the other one? 55% overall disengaged. What are some of the strategies that leaders employ to move performance up this spectrum? Micromanaging. Yeah, creating policies and procedures. Yeah. What's that, Joe? Yeah, creating policy and procedures? Absolutely. So that we can assure accountability. It's up to the policies and procedures to assure accountability. Well, here's a question. How does creating and enforcing policies and procedures to assure accountability different from leaders and teams who establish and align boundaries, guidelines, and expectations? what would be the difference, slight difference between establishing policies and procedures and actually establishing guidelines and co-creating alignment on boundaries and guidelines? What's the difference? What do you think the impact would be on the culture and on people's performance? Wow. Aligning together creates more ownership. Interesting. This side of the spectrum. Well, is ownership internal or external when we have to enforce these policies and procedures? Yeah, it's external. People are relying on us, on the leaders, to motivate and drive them. So, well, what's the benefit of internal ownership and motivation for performance and delivering results? Right, isn't that why we're all here? Show of hands, how many of you prefer to work in an environment where you're driving it yourself versus being micromanaged by others? That's what this performance spectrum is all about. Let's look at this middle section of the performance spectrum, engaged, moving to the right. And there tends to be two phases or categories inside the engaged as well. One would be a checklist mentality. You know that. People go to work just to get the job done. They do things and play it safe. Their motivation might be survival or personal pride. How many of you have experienced or witnessed this level of performance? So if the other level is a play it safe, how might a person or a team with a higher level engagement show up, like over here? They take more initiative, might be more of a risk taker. Yeah, somewhat of a cheerleader. Okay. Thanks for those. Yeah. You know, leaders spend a lot of time strategizing and actively attempting to gain buy-in with their teams and individuals. You know, hoping that they're going to sustain this level of engagement. But what's the difference between buy-in and ownership? What are your thoughts about that? Oh, again, more internally driven versus externally driven. Thanks. You know, a CEO at one of our large client partners recently said in a meeting to many of his employees that for many years we've had engagement and now it's time to go higher than that. We're not going to settle for mediocrity. We must move beyond this buy-in to higher levels of innovation and ownership where it's okay to take a risk. So how is a buy-in level of engagement different from a level of engagement? So that's point, that's the same question, it's just a different optional way of asking it. You'll see that in the leader guide. So back to this. Now let's look at ownership. The far end of the spectrum, where individuals and teams are every day inspired. And they're called all in. They're all in. They're going to do everything with discretionary effort. Great companies that intentionally build and develop their wellness culture in each and every action describe that their people are everyday inspired and all in, exhibiting personal accountability. Individuals and teams drive the initiatives and are fully committed to excellence. What other behaviors are evidence when people are performing at this level? Oh, they're self-reliant, dependable, high levels of trust. Morale is through the roof. Well, how does that play into what we were talking about yesterday about having to do more with less these days? Thanks for that. Yeah. Well, why do many people refer to this end of the spectrum as the fulfillment stage? What do you think about that? How important is it to you that you live a more balanced and fulfilled life? Notes to facilitators, there is a point here where if you have time and interest and it's appropriate, you can do a personal assessment and people can assess where they are on the spectrum and where they believe their leaders are in the spectrum. But let's keep rolling on and bring this to a close. So let's look at the three approaches of culture for a moment and compare them to the performance spectrum. Mary, would you remind us, looking on the flip chart, what are those three approaches? Fix it or reactive, thanks. Proactive, and what's the third one? Build and develop. Thank you. Which phase of the performance spectrum do each of the three approaches to culture align with? Where would you all put the reactive? Yeah. So if we have, what you're saying is if we have more of a reactive fix-it approach to culture, we're actually creating and aligned with disengaged and disengagement. Where would we place proactive? Right here. Say more about that. What do you see as the correlation between leaders that are building a culture in a proactive way and the level of engagement that we get in this part of the performance spectrum? So naturally then, leading question, where do we put build and develop? Going way upstream, building our wellness culture. Right here with the ownership section of the performance spectrum. The performance spectrum demonstrating for us how we can move from disengaged to ownership and the value and the importance of that. But the real question is how? How do we lead ourselves, others, and teams to be high-performing teams where in every day they're performing at this level of the spectrum? They're taking ownership in a way that accelerates business results. What would it mean to you if you already had a tool chest full of tools and strategies to achieve this performance spectrum? Let's explore this together. And at this point is when we break them into small groups and assign a tool to each group and ask them to identify 3 ways in which the tool that we've already explored together can up-level performance and move ourselves, move individuals and teams to higher levels of performance on the performance spectrum. That's it.